Recently, I started seeing posts on Instagram and news articles about the Democratic Republic of Congo refer to the currently ongoing genocide and exploitation of the land, resources, and people as a silent genocide. I understand why some would refer to it as a silent genocide. Not many people, especially in the Western world, know anything about the DRC or the living conditions for most of the people from there. But the truth is that the current situation in the Congo is not silent, it's just not reported on by Western media. In Europe and America, at least most people have some basic understanding of the history and politics of some of the countries, but when it comes to countries in Africa, the majority of the world hears nothing about them other than the occasional news story of another war or the living conditions there. And this can either be because people don't really care about Africa, so they don't do their own research, they don't look for sources themselves, or they think that the struggles happening throughout the African continent have nothing to do with them, which is already not true, but in the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially not true. What I want to do in this video is talk about the situation the country is currently in. To do this, we'll have to look through the DRC's history, how it developed, and why it is the way it is today. I'll also talk about how you, yes you, the person watching this video that probably lives in the US or another European country, are directly involved with the exploitation of the Congo, and more importantly, what you can do about it. So let's begin. To get a good understanding of the ongoing genocide unfolding in the Democratic Republic of Congo today, where else would we start but in Europe? In the mid-19th century, a revolution broke out in the Kingdom of the Netherlands that would result in the formation of the country that is today known as Belgium. They would become officially independent in 1830, with Leopold I becoming the King of Belgium for the first 30 years of its existence, and his son Leopold II reigning for the next 40 years after that. Now, both Leopold II and his father were interested in making Belgium into an economically important and powerful country, and surrounded by the likes of France, Great Britain, and the German Confederation, naturally the idea came to them that colonization was the answer. Now, interestingly, the Belgian government itself wasn't as interested in colonization as their king, and wanted to focus more on industrialization. This would turn out to be the correct path, not just morally, but also because Belgium ended up being one of the earliest examples of industrialization in the entire European continent. But regardless of this success and the general stability of Belgium throughout the 19th century, Leopold II continued with his obsession of making Belgium a great colonial empire. After his failed attempts to buy some of Spain's overseas colonies, most notably the Philippines, he decided to shift his focus to Africa. Now, by the 19th century, much of Africa had already been picked apart and colonized by various European countries, but the Congo, a part of Africa rich with materials like ivory and rubber, not to mention the at the time second biggest rainforest in the entire world, was still up for grabs, although the Portuguese did meddle around there for quite some time. In the 1870s, Leopold II founded the International Congo Society, an organization that would aim to convince both the Belgian public and other European powers that he had humanitarian goals for controlling the Congo region in Africa. In 1884, under the International Congo Society, representatives for King Leopold II would take part in the Berlin Conference. Joining him would be representatives for the kingdoms of Sweden, Norway, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the kingdoms of Portugal, the Netherlands, and Italy, the United States, France, Denmark, Spain, Austria-Hungary, and of course, the German Empire, with Otto von Bismarck himself being in attendance, a person I'll go more in depth on in my next history video. This conference was called by various European leaders to discuss the legal framework in which African resources would be split up by European powers. Africa had already been colonized by that time, but now European powers wanted to split up control over Africa and, in their eyes, legitimize their behavior by having laws that they could follow in how to correctly do colonization. The Europeans wanted a fresh start. This wasn't the colonization that their parents and grandparents did. No, this was a more civilized form of colonization, where the European powers would work together rather than fight with each other over occupied territories. Notably, the conference was not attended by any people who were actually African. By the end of the conference, Leopold II became the legal owner of the Congo, and in 1885 it became known as the Congo Free State. Now, the Congo Free State was personally owned by Leopold II and was not officially a colony belonging to Belgium, although Leopold bought the Congo Free State using financial support from the Belgian government. I point this out because usually a colony is owned by the country occupying it, but in this case, Leopold himself was the personal owner, and the police that enforced his rule, the Force Publique, was directly founded and controlled by him. The Congo Free State would only exist under Leopold II's direct control for 23 years. But even that was long enough for it to go down as one of Europe's most violent colonial projects. Now, having complete control over the Congo Free State, Leopold began to force people to harvest certain quotas of ivory and rubber to be collected by him, essentially a non-negotiable tax for existing. In the 1890s, the quota for rubber would increase due to a boom in demand for it, largely due to a surge in popularity of bikes. As the quotas became larger and more frequent, Leopold had to motivate the Congolese to work harder. This motivation came in the form of state-sanctioned violence at the hands of the aforementioned Force Publique, essentially the police that enforced the king's policies in the Congo Free State, which was mostly made up of other Congolese men, accompanied by white officers from Belgium. To assist him in his occupation, Leopold placed several representatives and people with similar interests in positions and powers around the Congo Free State. Maybe most famously the notorious Zanzibari slave trader Tipu Tib. Those who didn't want to work or didn't meet their quotas were killed. Sometimes refusing to harvest rubber meant your entire village would be burnt down. Arguably, the thing that the Congo Free State is most known for was the policy of cutting off the hands of people who had been killed to ensure that no bullets had been wasted, with their hands serving as proof of death, although dismemberment was not something that was only used on the dead. Apparently, this specific act was carried out by the Force Publique and not directly on the orders from Leopold himself, as he was reported to have said, "Cut off hands, that's idiotic. I cut off all the rest of them, but not hands. That's the one thing I need in the Congo." One of the cruelest acts carried out was the kidnapping of the wives and children of men in order to motivate them to work harder. A Catholic priest quotes a man as saying, "All blacks saw this man as the devil of the equator. From all the bodies killed in the field, you had to cut off the hands." He wanted to see the number of hands cut off by each soldier, who had to bring them in baskets. A village which refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean. As a young man, I saw Fieves' soldier Molili, then guarding the village of Boyeka, take a net, put 10 arrested natives in it, attach big stones to the net, and make it tumble into the river. Rubber caused these torments. That's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. Soldiers made young men kill or rape their own mothers and sisters. Sexual violence at the hands of an occupying force became a common occurrence. Some first-hand accounts from survivors read, "While I was working on making bricks at Mampoko, on 2 different occasions did the sentries in Kusu, Lomboto, and Itoku, to punish me, make me lift my bagne and put clay in my sexual parts, which made me suffer greatly. Once, 40 women had been working at the station of Boyeka. At night, the white man made them stand in line and ordered them to take off their clothes. When they were completely naked, he would choose one to spend the night with." Outside of direct violence carried out by the state, the living conditions were also dire, with rampant disease and famine spreading, resulting from nobody being available to work the land. It's hard to imagine how a person could deliberately inflict these conditions of life onto people, but I imagine for a person like Leopold II, it was actually quite easy. In the 20 years that he owned the Congo Free State, he didn't visit it a single time. It's estimated today that during his rule, he was responsible for the deaths of 8 to 12 million people. The work of photographers had begun to show the press and the public the truth behind his so-called humanitarian endeavors in the Congo, and soon began to turn on him. The violence in the Congo was so graphic and so unavoidable that even the British couldn't ignore it completely, and soon Leopold had to consider selling his colony. There were actually quite a few major works that came out of this time period that criticized King Leopold. Some of the most popular examples are a short story written by Mark Twain entitled King Leopold's Soliloquy, a satire of what a speech delivered by the Belgian king would sound like if he was defending himself, and Joseph Conrad's Hearts of Darkness, a novel that would be turned into the movie Apocalypse Now. Another big work that began to put pressure on King Leopold II was from a George Washington Williams, an American who was visiting the Free Congo state, who decided to pen an open letter to Leopold II describing what he saw there. I quote, "Your Majesty's government has been, and is now, guilty of waging unjust and cruel wars against natives, with the hope of securing slaves and women, to minister at the behests of the officers of your government. In such slave-hunting raids, one village is armed by the state against the other, and the force thus secured is incorporated with the regular troops. I have no adequate terms with which to depict to your Majesty the brutal acts of your soldiers upon such raids as these. The soldiers who open the combat are usually the bloodthirsty cannibalistic Bangalas, who give no quarter to the aged grandmother or nursing child at the breast of its mother. There are instances in which they have brought the heads of their victims to their white officers on the expeditionary steamers, and afterwards eaten the bodies of slain children. In one war, 2 Belgian army officers saw, from the deck of their steamer, a native in a canoe some distance away. He was not a combatant and was ignorant of the conflict in progress upon the shore some distance away. The officers made a wager of £5 that they could hit the native with their rifles. 3 shots were fired, and the native fell dead, pierced through the head, and the trade canoe was transformed into a funeral barge and floated silently down the river. By 1908, the pressure on the Belgian government was so much that they decided to annex the Congo Free State from the king, officially turning it into the Belgian Congo. Now, under the Belgian government and not Leopold II, nothing much changed. A lot of the leaders who were in power around the Congo representing Leopold's interests kept their jobs. Some living conditions changed and the amount of violence used to enforce quotas was toned down, but the Congolese people remained occupied by a colonial power that continued to use them as forced labor. In 1960, about 10 years after Congolese people had gotten the right to own property and build some form of economic base, people were able to vote for the first democratically elected leader, and a party called the Congolese National Movement, led by Patrice Lumumba, a strong believer in Congolese independence and Pan-Africanism, won the seat of prime minister. In June of that year, the King of Belgium would visit and officially grant the Congolese their independence. In his speech, the king not only ignores the effects of his family's rule over the Congo, but praises the almost 80 years of colonial oppression at their hands. Don't compromise the future with hasty reforms, and don't replace the structures that Belgium hands over to you until you are sure you can do better. Don't be afraid to come to us. We will remain by your side, give you advice. In response, Lumumba steps up and gives his own speech, and credit goes to YouTube channel KM Media for editing and adding subtitles to this speech.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté. La République du Congo a été proclamée et notre cher pays est maintenant entre les mains de ses propres enfants. Ensemble, mes frères, mes sœurs, nous allons commencer une nouvelle lutte, une lutte sublime qui va mener notre pays à la paix, à la prospérité et à la grandeur. Nous allons établir ensemble la justice sociale et assurer que chacun reçoive la juste rémunération de son travail. Nous avons connu les ironies, les insultes, les coups que nous devions subir matin, midi et soir, parce que nous étions des nègres. Qui oubliera qu'à un noir, on disait tu, non certes comme à un ami, mais parce que les voix honorables étaient réservées aux seuls blancs. Nous avons connu que nos terres furent spoliées au nom des textes prétendument légaux qui ne faisaient que reconnaître les droits du plus fort. Nous avons connu que la loi n'était jamais la même, selon qu'il s'agissait d'un blanc ou d'un noir, accommodante pour les uns, cruelle et inhumaine pour les autres. Nous avons connu les souffrances atroces des relégués pour opinion politique ou croyances religieuses. Exilés dans leur propre patrie, leur sort était vraiment pire que la mort elle-même. Nous avons connu qu'il y avait dans les villes des maisons magnifiques pour les blancs et des paillotes croulantes pour les noirs. Que les noirs n'étaient admis dans les cinémas, ni dans les restaurants, ni dans les magasins européens. Que les noirs voyageaient à même la coque de péniche, au pied du blanc dans sa cabine de luxe. Qui oubliera enfin les fusillades où périrent tant de nos frères. Les cachons furent brutalement jetés, ceux qui ne voulaient plus se soumettre au régime d'injustice, d'oppression et d'exploitation. Cette indépendance du Congo, si elle est proclamée aujourd'hui dans l'entente avec la Belgique, pays ami avec qui nous traitons d'égal à égal, ni les Congolais digne de ce nom ne pourra jamais oublier cependant que c'est par la lutte qu'elle a été conquise. Une lutte de tous les jours, une lutte ardente et idéaliste, une lutte dans laquelle nous n'avons mélangé ni nos forces, ni nos privations, ni nos souffrances, ni notre sang. Cette lutte qui fit des larmes, des feux et des sang, nous en sommes fiers jusqu'au plus profond de nous-mêmes, car ce fut une lutte noble et juste, une lutte indispensable pour mettre fin à l'humiliant esclavage qui nous était imposé par la force. Ce qui fit notre sort à 80 ans du régime colonialiste, nos blessures sont trop fraîches et trop douloureuses encore pour que nous puissions les chasser de notre mémoire. Quand nous avons connu le travail harassant, exigé en échange de salaires qui ne nous permettaient ni de manger à notre faim, ni de nous vêtir ou nous loger décemment, ni d'élever nos enfants comme des êtres chers.
Safe to say that the Belgians, Americans, and other European powers were not happy that someone with unflinching resistance towards their imperial goals and who acknowledged the abuse they suffered at Western hands was now in power in part of the world rich with natural resources. Soon, Lumumba implemented a policy of Africanization, a process of replacing Belgian and European ministers, employees, and soldiers with African ones. But most terrifying of all to the European and American powers, he talked about nationalizing Congolese resources, so the money made by Congolese people would stay in Congolese hands. Violence would break out across the Congo, and Belgians living there at the time decided to flee. The Belgian government sent their army to fight against Congolese forces in the name of protecting Europeans in the Congo. To make matters worse, a region of the Congo rich in minerals called Katanga, with the support of the Belgian government and a prominent Belgian-owned mining company, decided to secede from the Congo and form its own separate state, which led to a lot of violence along its borders because the majority of the people actually living there did not agree with the decision. Lumumba went to the US and then to Canada as well as the United Nations to ask for help with the uprising, and they all said no. With no other choices, Lumumba went to the Soviet Union to ask for help, who agreed. Now, earlier, the Congo had been used to manufacture rubber and ivory, but as time passed and the two world wars focused a lot of production on weapons, the Congo became a harvesting ground for minerals used in American weapons and products, most notably the bombs that would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were crafted using uranium from the Congo. With Soviet influence now right next to minerals used for the American army, the West decided Lumumba needed to go. Even worse, the president of the Congo, Joseph Kasavubu, a conservative, began to accuse Lumumba of being a communist and tried to have him removed from power. After this attempt was found to not be legal, he and the army's chief of staff, Mobutu Sese Seko, formed an alliance and took over the government. Lumumba would soon be arrested by Mobutu soldiers, taken to Katanga, beaten by Belgian and Katanga soldiers, and eventually executed by firing squad. His body would be dismembered and dissolved in acid, an attempt by his murderers to hide evidence of what they had done. All that was left of him was a tooth. Reports made by the CIA chief of station in Leopoldville, Lawrence Devlin, showed that he and Mobutu had a good relationship with each other before the coup, and that Devlin had described the situation in Congo as a classic communist takeover. The CIA themselves have admitted to planning the assassination of Lumumba, and in 2002 the Belgian government came out and officially apologized for their involvement in his assassination. And apologies are good and all, but it doesn't change anything. After almost 80 years of colonial occupation, the very first democratically elected leader of the Congo was assassinated with the support and encouragement of Western forces not even a year into his term, because he wanted to remove European influence over his country and keep the profits of Congolese labor in Congolese hands. After the coup, Kasavubu would rule over a very divided and weaker Democratic Republic of Congo compared to the one Lumumba had been voted into, and a few short years later, Mobutu would do another coup and establish himself as the sole dictator of the Congo, all with the support of the West and especially the CIA, of course. He would get rid of the parliament and ban all political parties except his own, the Popular Movement of the Revolution, or the MPR. But to be fair to Mobutu and the CEA, he did hold elections a few years later, which he overwhelmingly won. If we took a closer look at the ballot though, we can find that his name was the only option. Under Mobutu's rule, he implemented a new constitution that basically put his party as the only institution in the Congo, and every 7 years the Congolese people would get to vote. To be a candidate, you just needed to be the president of the MPR, which coincidentally always ended up being Mobutu. Torture and executions was a normal response towards opposition of Mobutu's rule. A report by Amnesty International at the time reads, "Hundreds of people have been arrested every year and detained for weeks, months, or even years without ever being charged or tried. Since President Mobutu came to power, there has been a series of trials of people accused of plotting to overthrow him. At the first, at the end of May 1966, the former Prime Minister Evariste Kimba and 3 others were sentenced to death after a summary trial by a special military tribunal. They were subsequently hanged in public. A very notable case of political corruption was in how Mobutu handled the uprising of Pierre Mulele, a revolutionary who had planned to overthrow Mobutu's government. After Mulele had been in hiding, the government had offered him amnesty, and when he emerged, they arrested and executed him. Outside of the brutal repression, Mobutu was also extremely corrupt, with him personally receiving up to 60% of the national budget to finance his own lifestyle, accumulating an estimated $5 billion throughout his reign. He also seized a lot of foreign-owned businesses, but rather than nationalizing them, he privatized them again and handed them off to his friends and family. Inflation skyrocketed to over 4,000%. The Congo had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world, underdeveloped and underfunded infrastructure, and a growing rate of unemployment and malnutrition. By the 90s, Mobutu's government became increasingly unpopular, but surprisingly, the chain of events that would lead to him being removed from power started from outside the Congo itself. In 1994, after a long civil war in Rwanda, the Hutu president Juvenal Habyarimana was assassinated. What followed was around 100 days of Hutu extremists killing around 500 to 800,000 Tutsi political figures and civilians in what is now known as the Rwandan genocide. The genocide would only come to an end once the Rwandan Patriotic Front seized control over the government. Fearing retaliation, many Hutu civilians and accomplices in the genocide fled over to the Congo, where Mobutu welcomed them with open arms. Unsurprisingly, some of the Hutus continued killing Tutsi civilians on the border of Rwanda and in the Congo as well. The new government of Rwanda, now made up of more Tutsis, realized that Mobutu wasn't going to do anything about the violence, and when Mobutu eventually ordered that all Tutsis in the Congo be expelled, a revolution broke out. The Rwandan and Ugandan governments, along with the Congolese Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, led by Laurent Désiré Kabila, declared war against Mobutu's government and eventually came to overthrow him in 1997, with Laurent Kabila now becoming the leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, despite Kabila overthrowing Mobutu, he was not a popular leader in the Congo. People began to assume he was under the control of the Rwandan government since they had helped him get into power, and as a response to try to legitimize his power, Kabila decided to expel all Rwandan and Ugandan troops from the Congo. With very little public support, violence continued throughout the country, and people's quality of life stayed relatively the same. A poll carried out in 1999 asking civilians of the Congo which of the following events they had personally experienced in their families or among neighbors on the street or community they lived in, and they responded as follows. Individuals being robbed, 53%. Wounded by bullets, 42%. Arbitrary arrests, 40%. Assassination and murder, 39%. Settlements of accounts, 39%. Rape, 22%. Soon, armed Hutu groups began forming around the border again, and Rwanda responded by invading the Congo. What was already a terrible situation erupted into even more horrific violence. Very soon, even Congolese radio stations loyal to Kabila began advocating for civilians to take part in the violence. It should be stressed that people must bring a machete, a spear, an arrow, a hoe, spades, rakes, nails, truncheons, electric irons, barbed wire, stones, and the like, in order, dear listeners, to kill the Rwandan Tutsis. Wherever you see a Rwandan Tutsi, regard him as your enemy. The entire population has become a military population from today onwards. You will detect enemies and massacre them without mercy. This new conflict became known as the Second Congolese War, but some may know it by another name, the Great African War. Soon, other countries would begin to get involved, like Burundi, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Chad, Angola, and many more smaller militias and resistance groups joined in on the fighting. In 2001, Laurent Kabila would be assassinated by his own aides, only to be replaced by his son, Joseph Kabila. In 2002, a peace treaty would be signed between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo that would end the war, at least on paper. Now, I want to take a break from talking about the violence and talk about the effects of that violence on the people actually living in the Congo. A 2006 study by the Congolese government, 3 years after the end of the war, revealed that 76% of the population could not send their children to school, 79% were malnourished, 81% did not have adequate housing, and 82% had no access to medical care. Overall, 71% of the population lived in absolute poverty. According to aid organizations in 2000, 31% of Kinshasa's residents were chronically malnourished and only 10% could afford 3 meals a day. In 2003, the average food intake of the population was 1,300 calories per day. The health system was largely destroyed, and reportedly 500,000 people died of malaria each year, more than a third of them children under 5 years old. Estimates on deaths relating to the conflict go higher than 5 million deaths, making this war the most violent since the Second World War. Over 3 million people were displaced and are now living in surrounding countries. Some have even taken to moving into the Congo's forests and relying on hunting animals to survive. There is a point I want to make when it comes to talking about countries like the Congo, countries who seem to have a never-ending wave of violence and political instability. Violence and deplorable living conditions continue to exist in the Congo, but because it's so normalized and so frequent, it isn't really being reported on anymore. Countries like the Congo or Palestine are seen by the West as an uncivilized place, always at war with each other, where people just can't seem to figure out how to govern themselves. They just can't seem to figure out the right way to peace. And that's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. But that's not true. And that way of viewing the world is only born from an uneducated and uninterested understanding of history. The Congo went from being colonized for 80 years under one of the most brutal colonial regimes to electing its first democratically elected leader who would have implemented policies that would have helped the Congo but damaged profits for foreign investors. The leader that the Congolese people elected was then assassinated with the help of their former slave owners, replaced with a brutal dictator that was supported by the West, who was then also replaced by another military leader who overthrew him in a coup. The violence that continues happening in the Congo today is the consequences of the political instability guaranteed by Western involvement in the country for the last 100 years. Even though we've talked about the wars and the instability itself, there is still arguably the most important part of the equation that needs to be talked about, that being the control over the resources in the Congo. The Belgian colonization of Congo and the forced slavery of the Congolese to produce material for their owners was done to boost Leopold II and Belgium into economic superpowers. There's a reason the colonization of the Congo looks so different from the American expansion to the west, or the French colonization of Algeria, because unlike those countries who want to expand their territories, the Belgians wanted to exploit the profit from the material and the labor of the Congo. Once the Congolese had won their independence from Belgium, Patrice Lumumba wanted to nationalize Congolese mining companies to make sure that the wealth being generated by Congolese labor stayed in their hands and not European and American capitalists. Lumumba, like many leaders and revolutionaries in the global south that hurt the pockets of Western capitalists, was murdered and replaced with Mobutu, who ensured the West that supported him throughout his dictatorship that the flow of minerals and cash would not stop. Mobutu, his family and friends, and foreign capitalists made themselves rich off of the exploitation of Congolese labor and resources, while the people who actually did the work and their families became poorer and poorer. As soon as the Cold War had ended, the Americans stopped their support of Mobutu since there was no more threat of Soviet influence. Mobutu was then overthrown, only for the country to plunge into a brutal war right after. Both Rwanda and Uganda have made claims that part of the eastern Congo, the part that is most rich in resources, should belong to their country, not to mention the numerous smaller armed militia groups that are fighting over control in the same area. And then, of course, is the matter of how resources are stripped from the Congo without the Congolese people getting any of it, neocolonialism. To talk more about it, I want to define the term. Neocolonialism is a form of imperialism, but unlike colonialism, which is at least open about its violence, neocolonialism hides behind various forms of cultural and social influence. Both colonialism and neocolonialism involve one country controlling and exploiting another. The only difference is how the exploitation is enforced. Colonialism is carried out with a direct force. It's the British Empire conquering and exploiting its overseas colonies. It's countries like the United States and Israel who import a foreign population, get them to believe in nationalistic myths, and then begin to expand and replace the original inhabitants of the land via ethnic cleansing. It's the Portuguese Empire using Catholicism as a civilizing force in Africa. Neocolonialism tries to be a little sneakier. Instead of using force, the original colonial power will say, okay, we grant you your independence, but then continue to use social and economic influences to continue to exploit and control the now independent country, using things like financial assistance, multinational companies that work in one land but are owned by people in another, or military support of a corrupt government that is unpopular with the people living under it, which just so happens to be in support of Western influence. It's when the French implement a new currency in its former colonies at a rate of 2 to 1 compared to the franc. It's when organizations like the IMF lend money to desperately poor countries, but only on the condition that the country implements new economic policies that typically favor the very same countries that made them poor in the first place. It's when the United States supports dictatorships that favor their economic interests all around the world, like the Congo, but will sanction countries that don't support their financial interests. Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, said, "Neocolonialism is an instrument of imperialism, which, like colonialism, is an attempt to export the social conflicts of the capitalist countries. The result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than for the development of the less developed parts of the world. Investment under neocolonialism increases rather than decreases the gap between the rich and the poor countries of the world." The Democratic Republic of Congo is a massive country, about the size of all of Western Europe. Not only is it one of the most resource-rich parts of the entire world, but it also borders 9 other countries. Political instability in this country also affects the countries bordering it, especially those on its eastern border. Political instability, and more importantly, keeping a population poor and in fear of the police and other militias so that they are more concerned with barely surviving rather than organizing and resisting, keeps a country in a state that is easy to control. And companies that are profiting from Congolese mines are making sure the conflict continues. Reports from Global Witness states European and Asian companies, including Bangkok-based Tyserco, a subsidiary of British Metals Group AMC, UK-based Afrmex, and Belgium-based TradeMet, have been buying minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo that are funding armed groups and fueling conflict. In the past 20 years, even Chinese capitalists have been involved in Congolese mines and have come to own over half of them. Companies like Google, Tesla, Apple, Intel, and Samsung all source cheap minerals mined from the Congo in their products. Lithium and cobalt is used in almost all electronic devices, from phones to computers to electric cars. And this doesn't even mention minerals like diamonds that are bought by high-class jewelry companies like Bulgari, Cartier, Boodles, Christ, and Rolex that have all been connected in one way or another to mines with highly unsafe working conditions. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire world literally runs on and is supported by minerals mined in the Congo. But wait, I hear you ask. I thought that in Europe and America, the civilized world, we have a way to check that minerals aren't taken from slave labor and the like. Surely if the US and other Western countries knew about this, they would put a stop to it, right? And sure, on the surface, the governments and owners of the companies involved with the exploitation of the Congo say they're trying their best. But there are easy ways around this. For example, meet Israeli businessman Dan Gertler. He is the grandson of the founder of the world's largest diamond exchange and the founder of Dan Gertler International, a collection of companies and mines that operate in the Congo. Dan Gertler is a close friend of Joseph and Laurent Kabila, and briefly had a monopoly over all diamonds mined in territories controlled by the Congo, until the IMF made them liberalize their economy, that is. They can't have all that money going to just one billionaire piece of shit, you know? Anyway, Dan Gertler's mines have been linked to many human rights abuses, all while he continues making money. Gertler's involvement in corrupt business deals and human rights violations got so bad that even a country like the United States decided to impose sanctions on him. Now, to a person like Gertler, who deals with international businesses almost exclusively, the inability to use US banks should have ended him financially. And yet, he is still raking in money from his mines. How? Well, if I was a billionaire who made his money off of what is virtually slave labor and I just got sanctioned, I probably wouldn't stop doing what I was doing. No, I'd probably begin setting up proxy companies and creating bank accounts that aren't in my name. I'd probably go to my longtime Congolese business associate, Alain Mukondo, and make him the director of 2 of my most profitable companies while restructuring, moving their headquarters, and renaming the rest of them. Then, I'd probably have him open up 10 new companies in the Congo and have him deposit around $11 million in 6 months in a new bank account that definitely isn't going to me. Then, 3 years after I've evaded sanctions and the Americans decide they need another PR win, they can sanction Alain as well, and I can start the whole process over again. It's a win-win-win for all parties involved, except for the people actually doing the work. Gertler continues making millions off of dollars of slave labor, the Americans can pretend they care about Africans and workers' rights, and the public can rest easy knowing that their diamonds and the minerals and all of their cars and electronic devices are definitely not made by slaves. And this isn't the only way Gertler can get around sanctions either. For example, recently Gertler made a deal with the current president of the Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, that he would give the Congo some of his mines and oil fields, and in return, Felix should ask Biden to weaken the sanctions against him. And it worked. Although Gertler is still sanctioned, they are definitely weaker than they were just a few years ago. Now that we've talked about the history and how minerals are controlled, let's talk about the actual life for people living in the Congo. As of July 2023, well over 5.5 million people are internally displaced in the Congo. Reasons for this can range from violence to forced displacement at the hands of mining companies who force people to flee. An interview given to Amnesty International by a man whose village was destroyed says, "Chemath's representative told us you need to leave the village now. We asked him, where would we go? It is where we're raising our children, where we're farming, and where our kids are registered to go to school. We weren't able to retrieve anything, we had nothing to survive on, and spent nights in the forest." An estimated 72% of the population lives in poverty, and the country suffers one of the highest child mortality rates in the world. On top of crumbling social infrastructure, the country has repeatedly suffered multiple public health crises, most notably due to COVID-19 and Ebola, but also from AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases. An estimated 120 different armed groups are active within the Congo. Between January and October of 2023, over 2,400 civilians have been killed by armed forces, with at least 155 of them being killed by the Congo's own military. Some of this violence has been in the form of ethnic cleansing. Militias made up of Hutus, some of which were participants in the Rwandan genocide, have forced over 100,000 Congolese Tutsis to flee. Genocide Watch describes the act as Stage 9 extermination on the 10 stages of genocide. Militias have been involved with numerous massacres, the kidnapping and recruitment of children, and sexual violence. In one region alone, during the first quarter of the year, 38,000 cases of sexual violence were reported. I'll let a survivor of this violence tell their story themselves.
Il est daté le 29, c'était sawa kama shamba. Wakaanza kunibakia jele minofu ya wanangu. Nimesabia wa kwanza, wa pili, wa tatu mpaka 12. Na wakati nimesabia 12, nimesikia kushambre, ngine watoto wangu nao wanaanza lia. Mama, nikapoteza akili. Mtoto wa kwanza alikuwa na 14, mwingine alikuwa na duza. Kuna ile siku wote wakabeba mimba.
And then, of course, there's the working conditions of the mines. Much of the mining done in artisanal mines, that being mines that are dug by hand or with minimal equipment, usually just a shovel or a pickaxe rather than with industrial mining equipment. I'll extensively quote an interview with Siddharth, a researcher on modern-day slavery and author of books about the subject here. Imagine an entire population of people who cannot survive without scrounging in hazardous conditions for $1 or $2 a day. There is no alternative there. The mines have taken over everything. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced because their villages were just bulldozed over to make places for large mining concessions. So you have people with no alternative, no other source for income, no livelihood. Now add to that the menace in many cases of armed forces pressuring people to dig, parents having to make a painful decision. Do I send my child to school or do we eat today? And if they choose the latter, that means bringing all of their kids into these toxic pits to dig just to earn that extra 50 cents or $1 a day. That could mean the difference between eating or not. So in the 21st century, this is modern-day slavery. And then the worst of all is what happens in tunnel digging. There are probably 10,000 to 15,000 tunnels that are dug by hand by artisanal miners. None of them have supports, ventilation shafts, rock bolts, anything like that. All these tunnels collapse all the time, burying alive anyone who is down there, including children. It's a demise that is almost impossibly horrific to imagine. And yet, I meet mothers pounding their chests in grief, talking about their children who had been buried alive in a tunnel collapse. In addition to forced labor in hazardous conditions, the children were also being exploited in a system of debt bondage. An economic advantage was being used to extract forced labor from them, and the debt was not being discharged based on a fair market value of the output of their labor. Threats of violence, eviction from the worksite, and the lack of reasonable alternatives kept the children ensnared in the system of bondage. In essence, they were child slaves. Now, I have a confession to make. I've known about what the situation in Congo was for a while now, but not the extent of it. I'd been interested in politics and history for a while, but never got into actually studying it since October of last year, largely pushed by seeing just how fast the Israeli ethnic cleansing of Gaza spiraled into a genocide, and by seeing the world's reaction to it. I can't even count the amount of times that I personally have been kicked, hit, or spat on by a German police officer in the last year, and I know that for others it's been far worse. One of the most important things for me when it came to wanting to do anything was education. You need to know what's happening, and most importantly, why something is happening to do anything about it. The struggles of Palestine, Congo, Sudan, Haiti, Peru, and many, many more, including our own liberation, are all interconnected by a system that not only allows but encourages the actions that directly worsen the lives of the people in the Congo. There are actions that can be taken. For example, protesting, organizing, signing petitions, and making donations are all great first steps. But what's happening in the Congo is not some fluke that's happening because of bad luck or because the right people aren't paying attention. It is the point of the economic system we live in. The Congolese people will keep being exploited as long as it's profitable. So there are two things that can be worked towards in order to help. 1. Work towards dismantling the system by organizing with anti-capitalist groups and educate yourself about how capitalism and the neoliberal policies that are implemented in the third world to exploit labor and resources work. And 2. Make the exploitation of Congolese people less profitable. Apartheid in South Africa didn't end because the white people it benefited decided it was wrong, or because some people protested. The South African apartheid state crumbled because it became harder and more costly for countries to support it, until eventually they couldn't hold on and it crumbled. You have to force change, and the people who support the system have to be dragged kicking and screaming into the future. That's what is slowly happening to Israel, and why the boycott, divest, and sanction movement specifically is being targeted by governments as anti-Semitic as an attempt to stop it. Because ultimately, the only thing that matters is profit. Companies are closing factories in Israel, ports across the world are not letting Israeli ships dock, and countries are beginning to recall ambassadors and suspend trade agreements. All of these little actions hurt the apartheid state of Israel more and more until one day soon, it will be too expensive for even the Western nations of the world to support it. And as soon as that support is pulled, the state will crumble. Another big thing that can be done to help is by being more considerate of where we buy our electronics. If you're still buying a new phone or a new computer every year, consider just using yours until it doesn't work anymore. If you need to replace your electronic devices like your phone or a TV, consider buying them from second-hand retailers. What's happening in the Congo won't be fixed by protests and by some simple reforms. What we need is a mass movement against the government structures that allow any of these things to happen and force them to change, and nothing less.